Hey watercolor people, this is Dina from dinadraws.com, and today I want to look at an autumn palette that I've been having a lot of fun with. And I want to work with something that's a little bit unexpected. So some of the expected reds and oranges, but also some interesting twists and turns in the variety of colors that we're going to use. So the palette that I'll be using is PY110 ISO Indolinone Yellow. This is a transparent, light fast, and very orange biased yellow, very lovely color. I'm using PO48, which is quinacridone rust, a beautiful yellow biased orangish rust color which will granulate. To complement these, I'm using dioxazine violet. So both of my original paints here are M. Graham, and the dioxazine violet I've just added is Talon's Rembrandt. Both these brands tend to travel a lot in water, so the fact that my dioxazine violet is not moving as much in water tells you more about that pigment than about Rembrandt. Rembrandt and M. Graham both travel very well and flow a lot. If you like less of that motion in your paint, then Winsor Newton is a good choice. It tends not to be quite so explosive, but I like a lot of movement. My last color is ultramarine blue, which gives me the option of making some muted greens with my PY110. So again, to recap, I have PY110, which is ISO Indolinone Yellow, a somewhat underutilized and underrated color, I think. I have PO48. This is M. Graham's particularly lovely version of this color. Quinacridone rust is what they name it. I have Rembrandt's dioxazine violet, which is PV23. And I have ultramarine blue, PB29. All of these suggestions lead me to want to create some autumn leaves. And when I do this, I tend to paint in a very fluid and abstract and free-flowing way, but watercolor has lots of different personalities, and one of them is actually very careful and controlled. So it's this type of painting and a building up of glazes and a sticking to a planned and structured shape that I'm going to explore today. And I'm going to make this work so that if you want to paint along, this should be easy and productive. So let's create some autumn leaves. So for this whole pencil sketch thing, I'm using a 4B pencil, so it's a little bit darker than I might use if I wasn't filming this, just because I need the pencil lines to show up for you and not just for me, at least initially. So this is still a pretty hard pencil. Hard pencils create light marks, they don't put a lot of graphite down on the page, and therefore they're less likely to get stuck under your watercolor layers and remain visible. Now, how do I go about drawing a maple leaf? The way that I approach this is by looking at the veins of the leaf to tell me what direction the various tissues and materials actually grow. So when I look at the maple leaf, I see that there is a center point from which the veins radiate outward. I can then use that structure to kind of follow and flesh out all of those different shapes. So we have 3 points that usually sit just about vertically on that leaf, and they all come to these little tapers, these little teardrop, house-shaped, roof-shaped kind of tapers with little jagged aspects to them. And then there are 2 smaller versions of that that radiate out a little more horizontally. And then at the very bottom of a maple leaf, you usually get these little downward-facing projections that are less complex than the different areas of the leaf that poke up above them. For a serrated leaf, something kind of like an aspen that's dried, I create the center line of the vein. So again, it's that whole question of what direction am I going? Where's the vein in this leaf? And all of the structure comes from that knowledge. So in this case, I work these two sides down in parallel, creating little toothed areas to each side and trying to keep those lined up with each other. Once I've drawn my basic shape, I use a kneaded eraser and I just roll it over my drawing like I'm making a little clay coil, like I'm making a little snake out of clay. What this does is it pulls up any excess graphite, but it leaves some deposits of graphite down in the tooth of my cold pressed paper where it's visible to me. So ideally, a sketch for a watercolor drawing that you're making, a preliminary underdrawing for your painting, should be like a little secret between you and your paper. It should be visible up close to you, but if you step back from it, it should really start to recede. That's how you know your drawing is light enough but strong enough that you can still use it as a guideline. Now I'm going to add a wash of color over the entire surface of that leaf, dropping in wet colors throughout this process. So I'm patchworking in different colors into a wet surface and using this kind of ongoing traveling patchworking of color to cover the surface of the leaf in a wash. So I should mention what paper I'm using here. I'm using a pretty inexpensive vintage version of Strathmore 500 Imperial. So this is a pretty low budget, student-y friendly paper. You can get a 10-pack of this stuff for about $50 for full sheets. So what I like about this paper is it's cotton, so I get consistent washes. I get bleeds that travel together, blend together well. I don't get a lot of hard wash lines when I'm working my color like this, block by block, in patches, changing colors as I go. What I don't like about this paper is that the texture can be a little bit obnoxious and it is very, very hard sized. So even though it doesn't lift up the way that, say, Montval or XL or some type of wood pulp paper might lift up, it's very easy to lift, even staining colors. So this has advantages and disadvantages. But for this project, if at all possible, I highly recommend and encourage using some type of cotton paper, even if it's a cotton mixed media paper that's not specifically sized for watercolor. Your transitions between colors are just going to be much more satisfying, much more consistent, and much more controllable. If this were wood pulp paper, I would in no way be able to mess around and kind of push these colors together and wipe up areas where I might see that I have a little more water than I want. So all of this is created by washes of primarily my isoindolinone yellow combined with my purple and with my quinacridone rust, dropped unevenly into this wash and swatched together in a blocking patchwork kind of approach where every wet area touches, butts up against some other wet area of paint. I am going to use the same approach to paint this browner, more dried serrated leaf, but I'm going to emphasize different colors. So I'm starting with almost a deepest, darkest mass tone of my rust color at the tip of the leaf. I'm working that together with my purple to get that unusual brown that is actually a combination of my dioxazine violet and my quinacridone rust primarily. So as I work my way down, I add more of that purple. I'm really kind of pushing and exploring that purple and rust interaction. And I don't know about you, but I think it's really quite beautiful. So these browns are just very rich. They have a certain pretty, articulate, interesting quality. They just pop. They're very transparent browns. And there's no way that I could get these kinds of browns from the kinds of earth colors that just get included in sort of a beginner palette set, right? I'm getting a much richer, more transparent, and more varied experience of the color brown than I would otherwise. So again, because I'm working on cotton paper, even if it's not the greatest type, I have a lot of latitude for pushing this color around, for noodling around with the way that these little isolated puddles of different colors join up and interact. So I'm primarily just color blocking in and filling in this shape. I left my stem to dry in my first iteration. This time I'm painting the stem in. And since I have this amount of time at my disposal, since this paper is not just drinking up this paint so fast and it leaves it on the surface a bit, I'm able to go back, evaluate, and say, you know what, I don't really like that super yellow patch in there. It's looking a little dark and mottled, and I can just use a damp brush to wipe it up. By the time I've finished covering this leaf, my first has pretty much dried, so I use the tip of my brush and some dark mass tone color to paint in my stem. So now this is that magical stage where we just have to wait. We have got to let these things dry. If I go in and I start intervening before these layers are dry, I'm going to get blooming. I'm going to pull apart and challenge the surface of this paint when it is vulnerable and damp. So a wet surface you can manipulate. It's not going to be affected by that. You're not going to get unwanted textures too much. A damp surface is when we start to see those unwanted textures developing if we start working that paint a little bit prematurely. That surface is delicate, and the introduction of more water is going to create rings and textures within it. So something I often do is pick a part of my motif that is dry, if not all of it is dry. There's usually one part that's starting to dry ahead of the others, and it's easy to get impatient, so that's one way I work around that. I've switched my brush from a size 8 faux squirrel, so a very soft, floppy synthetic that mimics the qualities of squirrel. It's literally called Mimic. They sell them at Jerry's. They're not bad, but I prefer Treckel's version called Onyx. So this is a very floppy, thirsty brush, and now I have switched. So I've switched to a synthetic sable. This is a number 4 round. Comes to an extreme point. This particular version is by Treckel, a Princeton version that is really nice for a brush very equivalent to this is the Aqua Elite. This is a slightly stiffer brush with a very fine point, and the way that I'm handling my work now is very different from how it was when I applied my first layer of wash. I am picking up very sheer, very dry, very slight amounts of paint. I'm hardly wetting my brush. I'm controlling both paint and water a great deal. One of the things that I found very not obvious about watercolor, and one of the things that I think does not get demonstrated and discussed fully, at least it wasn't in a way that I understood it. I kind of had to noodle around and figure this out for myself. The smoothest transitions, the softest, most line-free gradients, the smoothest treatments and applications of color in watercolor are those that we achieve when we blend wet paint against wet paint, so the paint runs together and there are no distinct edges. The other way to create these really smooth, invisible, subtle transitions is to use the driest possible brush. It is counterintuitive. You think dry brush, that gives you texture and marks, and it can, but using a brush that has just a little breath of water on it, just a little breath of pigment on it, and working that pigment slowly and consistently over a dry layer of paint is a way that you can deepen that color, you can add to that color, you can do additive processes without having lines and edges within your additional material. So here, in this particular instance right here, when I'm painting now, it was not dry enough, and I was able to get away with it with this paper, which I'm amazed by, because often that's when we get a lot of frilly edges and cauliflowering from me not being patient enough. But in this case, I managed to skate away from it. So I moved from that area of the leaf, which was still a little damp, and now I've resumed working some color over a completely dry area of color. I'm using pure, straight iso-indolinone yellow over these slightly light yellow but slightly chestnut, kind of varied areas of wash. The color that I'm applying on top of this does not vary wildly. I'm not creating that same level of patchworking and color blocking and variation within the color. I'm adding, in many instances here, just a flat, very thin, very sheer application of my yellow. And what we get is this gorgeous, glowing, varied color shining out from underneath this transparent layer of color. To me, this is the superpower that watercolor has. It's this ability to optically mix in a way that is just so satisfying, so sublime, and so subtle. I think even oil paint, which I love for that property, doesn't come close to the degree to which watercolor is capable of doing this kind of optical layering and giving us this kind of glowing, rich color. So that was what I wanted to really play with today, what I really wanted to explore and experience. So my tips for getting this type of result, if this is something you see and something you're interested in, is to go slow, remove water and paint both from your brush constantly. I have a paper towel. You've seen me blot it on screen briefly, but it is right out of view, and I'm constantly touching my brush to that paper towel, removing a little bit of water, removing a little bit of paint before I even start spreading that pigment and that slight amount of water around. This gives me this very flat, consistent, even, and slow buildup of color. And the yellows and golds that I get this way are colors that I don't think I could possibly arrive at through any other method. That's why we go through the trouble. This can be very time-consuming, but I find it very peaceful, very meditative. I find that it really connects me with my subject. It really sort of steeps me in the energies of the subject matter that I'm looking at or that I'm painting and depicting. So you may love the fast, fluid, gestural nature of watercolor, and that is 90% of the time what I'm showing up for when I paint with this medium. But I urge you to also give this aspect of the medium a chance and spend some time with it, and really start to cultivate some skills in using very tight, very dry, very pigment transparent, pigment unloaded brushes, and just seeing what that is, seeing what that feels like, and experiencing the high degree of control that you can get that way. Now, there's always time to make mistakes and change your mind. So here I was so intrigued by this feeling of control and feeling so confident in this idea of tight control. So I started doing some negative painting of some light leaf veins, and very quickly, I realized that this was just not looking that good. So I changed course and I decided to cover this entire surface with a wash of mostly my quinacridone gold, a little bit of my iso-indolinone yellow mixed in, so I get this very rust gold cover over these purple undertones. So in a very basic beginner palette, a yellow over a purple is just going to give you neutral, it's going to give you brown, it's going to give what people often pejoratively call mud. I don't think that I'm getting mud here at all. I think I'm getting some unbelievably beautiful russets that I just would not be able to arrive at if I didn't have that purple underpainting, right? Those marks, that variation that sets up this inconsistent, glowing layer of color that I'm able to create by layering color on top of color. Again, my brush is precise, my brush is almost dry, and the layer of color that I'm spreading here is very dry and very thin. It's very pigment poor. It's very subtle. So this is that time where you're going to want to use that paper towel. I reinforced the stem with some darker color, and I love that little bleeding transition that I get at the very bottom. So this just blends into the rest of the leaf very softly. And now I can let that dry. I could use my beautiful, precise synthetic sable brush to draw these lines, but I am all about using what is effective. I am not interested in whether my watercolor drawings will be Watercolor Society approved. I am not interested in meeting the criteria that people set up that watercolor must consist of only transparent watercolor. I like to use whatever tools give me the result that my work and my drawing desires and inspires. So for me, using a light fast color of Prismacolor colored pencil to draw in darker veins just made sense. The reference photos that I was looking at cursorily just to get ideas for how to draw these things all had these really beautiful dark brown verging on purple vein structures, and I just wanted to carry that forward. I could struggle with a brush, but there's really no need to do that. I really love the way that colored pencil layers on top of watercolor. I just think it's one of those materials marriages that makes so much sense. And I'm able to use colored pencil to enhance some of this rich transparency that I'm already getting through applications of watercolor. So this feels very satisfying and very done for the most part. Now I'm going to let my first browner leaf dry off, and I'm going to look for different opportunities to create veins in that leaf, and perhaps to even use paint and pencil to enhance what I have just a little bit. It seemed to me that echoing the way that the stem attaches to the leaf might make some sense. So I dropped in a little bit of my dark quinacridone rust-based wash. But this also felt a little bit dark, so it was very easy for me to go in with paper towel and just lift that color a tiny bit. Now I can wait for it to do what it's going to do, and it should give me a satisfying soft transition. When this browner leaf has dried, I go in with the same dark purplish brown that I used to give my maple leaf its veins. And contextually, this color just looks and feels different, but in a really satisfying way. I looked at a reference of a semi-folded, serrated, kind of dead and dying leaf that had some really beautiful russet tones, and it just inspired me to use this similar type of pattern and structure. You can see that my paper is even buckling a bit. If this were a serious work for framing, I'd be worried about that, and I would have stretched my paper or used a block, or frankly just used a slightly better grade of paper if possible. This earlier leaf has dried, and as I mentioned before, I am making work for my own satisfaction. I am making work for my own sense of what is a resolved and polished drawing, and to me, the arbitrary rules of transparent watercolor and transparent watercolor only are not especially useful. I want my work to just have its best possible qualities, put its foot forward in the best possible way. And many times this involves using mixed media touches to shore up edges, to enhance and deepen certain colors. There are so many beautiful and light-fast options for artist materials, even in a range of pencils like Prismacolor, that pencil artists might say is a little bit prosaic or a little bit budget. There are still many light, fast colors within that range. So I rely on those when I want to add some finishing touches or enhance or deepen some of the ideas that I'm already starting to develop in my watercolor painting. The line between drawing and painting in watercolor is very fluid. And it's really hard, in fact, for me to define what a drawing is versus what a painting is. Is a painting anything that uses paint? Is a painting anything that is not on a paper surface? And is a drawing, therefore, any work on paper that's not a print? That is one contemporary idea about what a drawing is, and it's sort of one that I find I subscribe to a bit. So, using drawing as a way to enhance painting just feels very natural to me and very fluid. And limiting myself to only using watercolor as a material, no matter what, feels very unnatural and very constraining in a non productive way. You do not have to add mixed media touches to your work, but if you have been hesitating to do that for any reason, if you have felt like there's some authority in watercolor that is urging you not to do it, and if you're starting to suspect that some of these ideas are a little bit gatekeepery, then I suggest getting out your pencils, your pastels, your opaque paints, oh no, and starting to see what they can lend to the already beautiful start that you may have in transparent watercolor. A surface can be a dark value color and still transparent. A surface can be an elaborate buildup of many layers of color and still be transparent. Transparency refers to that glow and the fact that we see all the color information that exists on the page behind every additional layer of color information. None of the colors that I've used are very primary or very fiery, with the exception perhaps of my yellow, my purple on its own, I guess. But as a whole, when we add these colors together, when we layer them up in an intelligent and thoughtful way, we can get some incredibly rich and fiery results. When I use pencil like this to enhance, I should talk about the way that I do it a little bit. So my use of this pencil is super, super light. I am hardly skimming the surface of this cold press paper. I am just tickling the surface of that paper and depositing little fractions of color, little bits of broken up color that just skitter across the surface of that rough cold press paper. That tendency of the applied color to be broken up inherently by the paper is part of what gives this a softness and a convincing feel. I'm not getting really hard edges. I'm not getting really opaque buildup of color. So I think that using colored pencil on cold pressed paper is actually a really smart strategy a lot of the time, and I think that it's something that's a little bit underexplored. Because I have these spaces in between the wax buildup of color and I don't have a very waxy surface, I can even go back with more paint and enhance some of these ideas that I was executing in colored pencil, just deepen that, enrich that, and just enliven that a little bit more with yet another layer of watercolor paint. I wouldn't go beyond this point, but I think that these last touches of a very sheer rust layer of color really help make this pop yet even more and really tie these leaves both together and make them feel like they came from the same world. Every time I add wet paint, I use a dried off, wiped off brush to spread that paint as thin as possible. And I need to make sure that all layers below that spreading are as dry as possible, or else I'm going to start to lift color. And that is a result that really will not give you desired results. You'll lose a lot of the smooth, shaded feel that you would otherwise get if your paper was perfectly dry. So here I have two little specimens that I'm very happy with. I'm going to show you 1/3 version, and I'm not going to talk through it. I'm just going to let it unfold. I hope that this has been fun for you, and I encourage you to try some leaves like this on your own. You can use the same palette I did, but you can certainly use your own variations. I hope that using complementary colors in this layered way has inspired you to think about your palette in a new and refreshing fashion. Now, if there are other topics you'd like to see me cover, other subjects you'd like to see me paint, if you have any ideas about what you would like to see more of going forward, leave those in the comments, and I encourage you to consider subscribing, hitting the notifications bell, or leaving a like. It really will help me out, and it will help me grow this community. I appreciate you watching, and for now, enjoy the paint through.